Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal, Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shweta Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the distinguished Indologist and scholar of Sanskrit and Indian textual traditions, Wendy Doniger, joining us from Cape Cod to talk about her book, The Cave of Echoes, Stories about Gods, Animals, and Other Strangers. Before we dive in, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patreon program on our website, where you can pay just $5 a month to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. In The Cave of Echoes, Wendy Doniger writes that it is impossible to define myth, but it is cowardly not to try. For her, the best way to approach myth is not by defining it, but to look at it in action, which is precisely what she sets out to do throughout this book. Drawing on Hindu epics, biblical parables, Greek myths, and modern mythologies, Wendy examines the enduring force of myth and tradition, and how they shape lives, societies, and cultures. Along the way, she raises critical questions about how we interpret mythic stories, and how different cultures engage with these foundational texts and traditions. Wendy, welcome to the Southasia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for taking such an interest in my book. I'm flattered and delighted.
Wendy, you've continued to write and reflect on myth since The Cave of Echoes was first published in 1988. And you've noted how students' responses and reviews have shaped your thinking. For example, in the 1995 preface, you discussed one particular example of this. The idea that it's harder to change rituals than myths. While you still broadly agree with that argument, you've since revised your view, acknowledging that myths and rituals are so intertwined that changing one inevitably affects the other. So with this new edition, how do you look back on the book and your earlier approach? And how has your thinking about myths and rituals evolved since?
It's a good question. I wrote that book over 30 years ago, and when I looked at it now, I didn't recognize it. I couldn't imagine writing such a book. I couldn't imagine who I was who wrote that book then. I recognized the jokes. I recognized the little turns of phrase, but I didn't recognize the sources that I quoted in the footnotes. Those are books I read 40 years ago, and I thought, wow, I read that book then. What I really recognized was the stories. I said, oh yes, that story. I recognize that. I didn't always recognize the arguments I made about them. The arguments didn't seem to me as interesting as the stories. So the basic argument I was writing was against the idea of something being just a myth, which meant just a lie, just a silly story, just something that has no relationship to truth. And I wanted to write to make people respect myths, and especially to respect the content, the truth content of other people's myths. So you could just say, well, the story of the apple in Eden is just a myth, and the story of Shiva and Parvati, not only is that just a myth, but it's a myth by some crazy people who live over there in India. Why should we pay any attention to that? So there was a double whammy. Even our own myths, our so-called own myths, the Christian and Jewish myths and so forth, were regarded as not having truth value, and other people's myths all the more susceptible to accusations of falsehood. So I was really writing for my people, trying to persuade American Jews to read Hindu stories and to take them seriously, and not just to say, oh, how Orientalist, how weird, these people have these strange ideas, but to say, they're writing about something I care about, and what they say about it actually makes more sense to me than what the Hebrew texts have said to me. I've worried about this all my life, and this story makes the kind of sense to me, partly because in some cases Indian storytellers just were better at it than the ancient Jewish storytellers, but also because we're used to Adam and Eve and we're used to all of that stuff. And the new stories seem strange. Wow, but in the end, they aren't strange. The people are wearing strange food and speaking a strange language and doing strange things, but they are dealing with our problems in ways which we never thought of and which allow us to say, my goodness, maybe that's the answer. Why didn't we ever think about that? So that's the eye-opening effect of thinking that a story might actually tell you something that matters to you in your own life, something that's been making you sad or angry or puzzled, and that you might find it better not in your own sources, partly because you know them and ignore them, and partly because some of the people who wrote the Bible just weren't as smart as the people who wrote the ancient Sanskrit texts. And you say, now, wow, that is an interesting way to approach the problem. So I cared a lot about myths. I cared a little bit more about rituals after I got to Chicago because I hung out all my life. I've been grateful to the kindness of anthropologists. There were wonderful anthropologists at Chicago when I joined the faculty in 1978, long before you were born. And so they taught me a bit about rituals, which otherwise I wouldn't have known about or cared about. And it was because of that I began to think that maybe seeing myths in the context of the rituals showed you an aspect of them. It didn't have the secret. It wasn't, aha, now I understand this myth. But it filled it out in an interesting way. It made you say, aha, I see that. So that's partly why I started taking rituals more seriously. I never took them as seriously as myths. I've never been a field worker. I've always been an armchair scholar. I read books. I don't go away and watch people doing things. So I'm always a myth person, but I began to really respect that sometimes you do understand the myth better when you understand the rituals in which that myth is recited. So
in the first chapter, you use the Indian metaphor of the hunter and the sage to reflect on the scholar's personal stake in studying myth. And you describe the hunting sage as your ideal historian of religions, someone who thinks and feels, who is self-aware in navigating both head and heart. You also write that all creative scholarship in the humanities is on some level autobiographical, and that scholars of myth in particular often find themselves caught up in the very stories they study. And you briefly touched on this, but for you, this became especially clear in the 1970s when your father passed away and you found meaning not in Jewish or Christian traditions, but in Hindu mythology. You write that you were like a hunter living through the very myths you were also analyzing as a sage. Could you talk to us more about how personal experiences have changed the way you approach myth as a scholar?
The Hunter and the Sage is a wonderful story that I found in the Yoga Vasishta, a wonderful Sanskrit text. The sage gets inside the head of the hunter in some ways, and it came to represent for me two different ways of thinking about the important human questions. One by meditation and reading and just staying home and thinking, that's the sage, and the other, the hunter, who actually goes out and sees things and experiences things. And in my day, a scholar was supposed to write about the stuff that he or she read in books, and so to be a sage. So here I was arguing that it was also relevant, necessary to use your own personal experience to bring to life your scholarship about your own texts and other people's texts. So the big questions about the meaning of life, about relationships with parents and partners and animals, we all have those experiences and then we read about them. So my thinking about my father's death became part of my thinking about all the myths of death. I began to understand them better, and I began to see how other people's texts, the people in their stories, and the authors of those stories had also lost parents and also lost other loved ones, and that not only the personal experience, the loss of a father, but everything you'd ever read about death, not just the Sanskrit text, but your whole mind was full of insights and ideas that you could find echoing or echoes from the Sanskrit text, that these weren't strange people. They had some different experiences. They lived in India. The climate was different. They ate different food. There's no question. But those differences precisely made them experience something like the death of a parent, both the same way we do and other ways that might be more useful to us than our ways. There are rigid ways. Rituals of death are very rigid because the people experiencing them are out of control to some extent, and the community takes over and says, sit here, drink this, eat this, touch this. People who are bereaved are grateful not to have to think in a way. So rituals really take over, and the poem that you recite, that you've recited all your life and so forth. So death of all the ceremonies is enormously ritualized in order to provide a kind of a crutch for people to use until they come back to life and can start thinking straight again, the way you do when you get over the first terrible impact of a death. And that's the place where other people's rituals can be even more useful in taking you out of your own narrow, solipsistic, no one has ever experienced this before, my life will never be the same, whatever it is that you've locked yourself into. So I thought that myth of the hunter and the sage, the way the sage got into the hunter's head, was a wonderful metaphor for the way we ought to open ourselves out to the emotional wisdom of other people's myths, which in some ways is the same as ours, in some ways is different from ours, but in any case can strike us with a new wisdom, even if the wisdom is not all that different from ours, because it comes at a different angle, with a different light on it. And we say, aha, now that's interesting. Why did I never think of that? And I think that that's the right way to read great literature in general, and certainly great mythology in general, because it so often deals with questions for which there is no answer. And the failed answer of your own tradition is both boring sometimes, invisible, and the failed answer of somebody else's tradition is often much more enlightening and more fun too. These people are wearing different clothes. They're dancing different dances. It clothes the bare bones of these gruesome, deep life questions in things that make it sneaks up on you. You don't realize how deep it is because you've been enthralled by the beauty of the poetry, the description of the gardens full of flowers you've never seen before, and so forth. So there are many reasons why these personal truths can come to you with more power and meaning from other people's texts than from your own.
And Wendy, you've written that the categories of true and false are inadequate when it comes to myths, and that myths can ring false when we try to construct or legislate them rather than interpret them. And like you said, different cultures draw different boundaries between myth, history, and fiction. And what one culture sees as myth, another might call history or legend. The myths you explore in this book deal with the kinds of questions that religion asks, whether that's about life or death, creation, meaning, etc. Since myth is at its core a narrative, how does it differ from other kinds of narratives like history or legend?
So early on, before I wrote that first book, when I was living in Russia in 1971, 15 years before I wrote that book, I met some anthropologists who introduced me to the work of the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. And one thing that he wrote in particular deeply influenced me and changed everything I did after that. He said something so simple and so true. He said the reason why there are so many different variants of great myths, even in a particular text, how the world began. Any Sanskrit Purana tells you 5 or 6 different versions of how the world began. Look at the Christian New Testament. There are 4 different gospels telling you the life of something that actually has a historical basis, which is the life of Jesus Christ. They tell it 4 different ways. So Levi-Strauss says the reason that there are so many different variants of a single important myth is that it poses a question to which there is no answer, that it's trying to tell you how to put a square peg in a round hole so that you just keep trying again and again. Every single myth is the failure to answer a great metaphysical question, so you try it again. That one doesn't do it either, and so forth and so on. So myth is doomed by the nature of the questions that it asks never to come to rest and say, well, that's done. I got that over. Let's try something else. Myth is always left open-ended because there is no answer. History has different problems. History works with different materials. It bases itself on physical and historical facts. But history, too, is often written in the shadow of the same agendas as myth. As we see in our own time, when what facts are available are twisted to serve particular religious and political agendas. We're not going to talk about politics, but your country and mine are in a very bad place right now because of this. So history doesn't exactly have just the facts, ma'am, and so forth. So it starts with facts, but it works just the same way as myth. It works to twist things around to get one answer from one person, another answer from another person. There is no single way to tell the story of how India began, whether America is a democracy. These historical things are also unanswerable and are therefore never at rest. They never come to a final resting place. Legend pretends to be based on history, but it merely begins with, at best, 1 or 2 historical facts. There was somebody named George Washington in America long ago, and then it takes off immediately from those facts to tell an entirely different story. So myth does not take off from physical facts or historical events. It takes off from shared, insoluble human problems, but it soon enters the same cloudy territory of human emotion that history and legend have to plow through, with very similar distortions. So some of the building blocks that you start with in legend have a different basis in what you would call hard facts, but it never stays there for long. It always takes off into the realm of human imagination in the attempt to answer bigger questions. What is truth? What is justice? What actually happened in the past? You can do it in human lives. Did your parents really love each other when you were little? Were you happy? Were you sad? We no longer have access to facts anymore. We have memories and we tell stories. Of course I love my parents. Of course my parents loved each other. Yeah, that's myth making. And we all do it. And if in fact one of your parents killed the other, you have some basis for fact, but most of us are in a shadier territory than that. And so the way we really live our lives is by taking those things that we remember that mean something to us and embroidering them with the human penchant for storytelling. I'm trying to write a memoir now. I am writing a memoir now. And I put down what I remember, and then I put down what I don't exactly remember, but the way I feel it was. And I have 10 years a younger brother, and I try it out on him. He said, that's not how it was. That's what mommy didn't do that. No. So it's hard to stick to the so-called facts. We are a mythologizing race. We tell whatever we tell in order to make ourselves feel better about it, to please the people we're telling it to. There are so many ways that we distort memory. There are some facts always, but the embroidery, is so much more important to us than the actual fabric we're embroidering on. So much for history and legend.
That's beautifully said, Wendy. And I'm also thrilled to hear that you're currently working on a memoir. Very excited about that.
I'm having fun doing it.
And Wendy, you write that in response to the colonial and missionary distortion of non-Western religions, much recent scholarship has leaned more towards cultural relativism. But you argue that truly engaging with other people's myths means being honest about our emotional responses to them, including discomfort. If scholars are allowed to love myths, you suggest that they should also be allowed to hate them, or at least critique them while taking them seriously. You give the example of the myth underlying sati, an archaic practice in India where a widow throws herself onto her husband's funeral pyre. You propose that scholars begin by acknowledging their revulsion and then work towards moving beyond it in pursuit of a deeper understanding. Could you say more about this balance between affect, critique, and empathy in the study of myth?
It's a tricky question, especially nowadays with such political confusion about attitudes toward others in general, which is what this is all about. I think some myths are violent because they're reacting to the violence of the human experience, to earthquakes and famines. And these are sad, but are not generally used in the service of political agendas, evil agendas. There are other myths, particularly those in the service of particular human groups, which distinguish themselves from other human groups. It could be Indians against Chinese, it could be men against women, white people against black people. These myths that are defined as being positioned in the service of particular human groups, are often violent because they've been used in the service of violent political agendas directed against particular groups of people. I'm thinking of racist and sexist myths, and the one that you have mentioned, the myth of sati, is such a sexist myth. There are Sanskrit texts that say that the wife of Shiva, whose name was Sati, which really also just means a good woman, burned herself to death voluntarily. And that myth has been used in history on some occasions to encourage human women to burn themselves to death on their husbands' pyres. So I think we have the right to make moral judgments about myths, about our own myths and other people's myths, if they support agendas that are injurious to particular groups of people. In my own tradition, I object to certain anti-Semitic myths that begin in the New Testament and are included in some of the great Christian works of art. One of my favorite pieces of music is Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and which tells the story of the crucifixion. And at one point he has a chorus of Jews singing, Kreuziger, 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 crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, crucify. And it's a great work of art. And every time I hear it, I go, oh my God, here comes that passage I hate. It's still a great work of art, but it has greatly contributed to the murder of Jews at different points in American history, and I wish that it didn't have that passage. You can't leave it out. It is part of the St. Matthew Passion. I would include the myths of sati in this same category because they have been used at certain times or places. I should say not very often. The place they've been mainly used is in British propaganda against Indians to say, look, these people are burning all their widows to death. They certainly need us to govern their country. They greatly exaggerated the prevalence of sati. So that's a mythologizing of a different kind. The British mythologizing of the practice of sati, which was largely limited at one point to Rajputs at a certain period in history and so forth. It wasn't something that all Hindus did. So that's a bit of political use of a myth right there. So the myth of Sati was used at certain times by certain people, and later on went to support other incidental agendas in more recent Indian history, such as the murder of widows for their dowries, which was not done generally. It's not that all Indian widows were murdered for their dowries, but some were indeed persuaded to kill themselves so that people could get their money. So that's a bad myth used by some people in a bad way, and I think it's a myth which should be discouraged from being retold, or better than that, should be told and explained what it is and why it happened and who used it and why it was misused by human beings to hurt other human beings. I think Indians should know about the myth of Sati and know that it was created at a certain time in history by certain political groups who found it useful to encourage women to kill themselves. So that's an important part of mythology too, the use of certain myths to persecute certain people. And I would call this a myth that was motivated not by genuine shared human questions, as great myths are. Why do we die? What happens to us after we die? But by the particular agendas of one group at the expense of another, and I would call it a hurtful myth, not designed to address deep, shared human questions, but perpetrated by one group of men, a certain group of Indian men at a certain moment in history, in order to hurt another group of human beings, certain Indian women at that time. So that's a category of mythology which I think should be recognized. But I'm sorry that people who are anti-religious in general or just anti-myth use it as an example of the reason why myths are bad. Look what happened in India with Sati. All myths. That's a peculiar, small subcategory of mythology, and it is indeed something that needs to be understood and banished if possible. But I don't think it casts a shadow on the importance and the beauty of the great religious myths that are told all over the world. So,
when literacy was not as widespread in South Asia, the written word was often reserved for the elite, while oral culture belonged to the people at large. You note that this was a pattern that prevailed for centuries in Europe and continues in many parts of India. Sanskrit, for example, restricted sacred texts and Indian classics to males of dominant castes, and widespread illiteracy meant that written literature, even in the vernacular languages, remained inaccessible to many. But you note that illiteracy doesn't equal cultural deprivation. In India, epics like the Mahabharata are experienced collectively through oral tradition, and this allows millions of people to deeply engage with their own classics. And similarly, with the rise of print, texts like the epic Ramayana became widely available, leading not only to more private reading, but also public recitations attended by large audiences. How does this fluid oral tradition empower marginalized communities and non-Sanskrit reading audiences to claim their own relationship to these ancient stories?
this is a very good question, and it's a very timely question. But the idea of making everybody in India speak Hindi, which people who I shall not name have recently propounded, goes against everything that India has always been and meant, and I hope it will not succeed. That said, let me say what I feel about the history of the problem, which is really a very interesting one. So the great texts I know best are the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And my long-lost wonderful colleague A.K. Ramanujan very famously once said, "No Indian ever hears the Mahabharata for the first time." So these stories were around for a long time. They're great big books. They're full of stories. God knows where they began. Lots and lots of stories. At some point, they were put into Sanskrit, and therefore the oldest written versions we have of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana are in Sanskrit. Big books. And Sanskrit has been traditionally the language of male Brahmins. But in the first place, there always were some women Sanskritists, right from the start. And also, these poems are collections of stories of a nature that in English have often been known as old wives' tales, Mother Goose fables. That is to say, those phrases in English reflect the fact that the tellers of stories in most traditions have been women who are raising children, doing household tasks that make them lie down, sit down for a long time, and tell stories. And so even these early Sanskrit texts that we have by Valmiki and Vyasa and all these fancy names of Indian sages may very well have originated in the oral traditions passed on by women. Moreover, the Mahabharata itself tells us that the stories were told and retold at sacrifices by people called sutas. And the sutta is a word that has two very different meanings. One is a poet, an oral poet, and the other is a charioteer. And the caste of sutas is a low caste. It is not a Brahmin caste and it is not a Kshatriya caste. It's a low mixed caste, whatever its origins. There are crazy stories about its origins, but as we get them. So these sutas were people who drove the chariot. That's why it's particularly striking in the Bhagavad Gita that Krishna drives Arjuna's chariot, because the charioteer is doing a low task. He is dealing with animals, which is unclean, and no Brahmin or Kshatriya would have done that. So during the day, he takes care of the animals. Charioteers had two guys in them. One guy had the bow and arrow. That was a two-hand task. The other guy held the reins in one hand and a shield in another and drove the chariot. That night, everybody went home, and if you survived and sat around the campfire and got a massage and had a couple of drinks or whatever they did in those days. And the sutas told the stories. He was wonderful today. There were guys coming at us on all sides. You should have seen all that. And the sutas, there were the basis of the telling of the epic stories. And the sutas of the people, it's in the Ramayana too. Rama's sons become sutas. They go from village to village singing these songs, these oral songs, and they are people of low caste. So these Sanskrit texts, Brahmin Sanskrit texts, male, are being transmitted according to the tradition itself by people of low castes. So even while you're still only dealing with Sanskrit versions of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, you have the input of women and you have the transmission by people of low castes. And once you get them translated into the vernacular, or I might even say translated back into the vernacular, because surely these stories were told in vernaculars long before the Brahmins collected them and put them into the Sanskrit text we have. They go back into the vernacular, then it belongs to everyone. And there is no one way of telling the story. When someone tells you the story, you don't say, you got that wrong. You say, my auntie told it to me differently. This happened to me in my days of teaching at the University of Chicago. There I am, the Sanskrit teacher. The kids are supposed to be listening to me. I am the teacher. I say, there's this story in the Mahabharata. It goes like this, and a hand goes up. I say, yes. And I say, yes, Radha, what is it? She said, my granny told it differently. And she tells us the way her granny told it. And indeed, she has every right to say that the story goes that way than the way that I was telling it in the classroom. So they come out of the oral tradition, they come out of women's traditions, they go back into the oral tradition, they go back into women's traditions. And so though we can certainly find male Brahman agendas in the text, God knows we can also hear, even in the Sanskrit text and in other versions, the voices of women and low castes. And therefore they really do belong to all the people of India. This distinguishes them, I should say, from a text like the Rig Veda, which was a priestly document recited in the sacrifice by Brahmins and is largely transmitted by Brahmins. So that text is a Brahmin text, but not the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Who wants to read the Rig Veda? Mahabharata is so much more fun than the Rig Veda. So That's, I think, is the answer to that. And going back to the present, it's told in all different languages, all different ways. There's the Telugu way of telling it. There's the Tamil way of telling it. The idea of making everybody in India speak Hindi is just such a bad idea. Such a bad idea. I hope it doesn't work.
For those of you listening, let's keep the conversation going. Please share your thoughts on the episode or on Wendy's book. Leave us a comment on YouTube or send me an email. You'll find it in the episode description below. Coming to a contemporary example, in India, you note that the fact that movie actors often become successful politicians shows how deeply films like myths are woven into the everyday life. Hindi films continue to perform many of the functions of traditional mythology. And while traditional storytelling still exists, films have taken on this interesting role as a modern space where myths live and evolve. I also believe this might be quite different to how film adaptations of myths are created or received in the West. So could you talk to us about how films in India create a kind of ritual space where myths and people's lives intersect in modern culture?
That's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on Indian film. I'm basically a Satyajit Roy kind of a viewer of Indian films and Merchant Ivory and so forth and so forth. But certainly the use of the television version of the Ramayana certainly, I think, played a role in Indian history. It was while the Ramayana was being broadcast that anti-Muslim fervor was being stirred up simultaneously, and it was during that period that they went and tore down the Babri Masjid, causing untold loss of lives and so forth. In America, that I knew, the old America, there was a mythic quality of films which was their own mythology. There were certain myths that were told, all of Hollywood myths of marriage and divorce and so forth. But in India, real magical, religious, mythical events have always been part of film. And I've always regarded them as yet another popular variant on the many. There's no one way to tell a Hindu myth. In America, about 20 years ago, there was a movie made about the death of Jesus, which got the myth makers into a lot of trouble. Implied he did not die on the cross and he lived on. He married Mary Magdalene and so forth. And there was real trouble about that. Many, many people felt that that story was not just a story, but the basis of their lives, and that there was a lie being told that Jesus had survived the crucifixion. Indians, thank goodness, are used to many, many different ways of hearing any story. Sanskrit texts have different variants, and then we were just talking about this. So film just naturally appears yet another way of telling a story that Hindus, as opposed to certain types of Christians, are used to seeing told different ways. I mean, the Christians should notice that there are 4 Gospels, but we will leave that for the moment. This idea that you could tell the story in so many different ways. And I think that gave a kind of license to the Bollywood people. They had the dance traditions, the Bharatanatyam traditions. They had centuries of Indian dance and theater, which already had made enormous variations. So Indians were very prepared to see on the screen a story told differently from the way their mothers had told it to them, or they read in Amar Chitra Katha comic books, which was the way that I think most Hindus got their mythology for a long time. And that's why there is such a wonderful freedom in the way that Bollywood movies have picked up and depicted Hindu myths. The fact that this Ramayana at that time was very military, and that Rama was depicted not as a sensitive and thoughtful person as he really is, at least in the Valmiki text, which is what I know best, but as a kind of a great muscle-bound warrior who was out to kill all his enemies, set fire to an already, unfortunately, powerful anti-Muslim movement that Modi was stirring up in India at that time, and led to this destruction of one of the great and most ancient and beautiful mosques in India. So that was a moment when television did some harm, I think. Not simply by telling the story differently, which everybody does, but by telling it in such a militarized manner that it fed into something that it didn't invent it. It didn't suddenly invent the idea that Hindus were going to do something to get rid of some Muslims. It added fuel to the already burning political fire and did some harm, and people died because of that television version of the Ramayana. So that's the power of film as well as the power of myth. And I don't know about your country, but in America, everybody now is more or less illiterate. So all they have is film as a source of mythology. The Lord only knows what's going to happen from now on. But.
And Wendy, you write that myths can serve as bridges between cultures. For example, Christians might find the myth of Krishna more accessible because of its resemblance to the myth of Jesus. You use the interesting metaphor of a railway roundhouse, where tracks converge and trains can switch paths, to describe how myths allow us to move between different realities and cultures. This quote-unquote mythical roundhouse is like a cave where all the world's myths meet, forming this common ground. But you also caution that this interconnectedness is not absolute. While there is a common thread running through the great myths of the world, the meaning of myths is always in flux and changing across time, cultures, and even geographies. Could you say more about this balance between interconnection and impermanence in myth?
I think this mythical roundhouse, trains coming in and out, is important. If you get down to basics, it's the shared human experiences. But the embroidery on them, the variants on them, are so important and are so changeable that it's very hard to see the shared base sometimes. So they're dealing with shared human experiences. They're dealing with death, desire, hunger, love, and fear. So those myths are often more easily understood across cultures than stories that depend more on particular national or political or even religious customs, on sacrifice or the flag or whatever it is. So the deep base has to be there, but the particular manifestations shift. So I think sometimes when we kind of get lost in the differences, I don't understand anything at all about that myth. It seems to be about nuclear weapons, and there were nuclear weapons in ancient India, so I can't see a parallel there. Well, what Indian myth is there to correspond to the horror of Hiroshima? Well, there are Indian stories about monstrous weapons, and there is ambivalence about them. There are wonderful stories about a guy who has a problem to solve, and he creates, or somebody, he performs tapas. He stands on one leg for 1,000 years, and he gets this great fire, and he burns up the thing that he wants, and the fire goes on burning, and it burns him. And if that is not a cautionary tale about Hiroshima, I don't know what it is. So going back to the basics is often a way to find your way back out of the parts of a myth from someone else that are so strange. I mean, these widows are putting things on their forehead and people are piercing their lips. And what are these strange people doing? And if you get past that to the heart of the story, you can come back out and go on to a moment when American pilots are flying a plane toward Hiroshima, and it's the same story. You need to go to the roundhouse, to the place where it meets, which is that cultures long before the invention of nuclear energy in, I may say, the University of Chicago, my old school, cultures long before that did imagine spectacularly destructive weapons. And they worried about it, and they wrote some intelligent stories in Sanskrit and in other languages about how to control that. One of the myths I've written a lot about is the story of the mayor. It's a story of a fire that Brahma creates to destroy something, and then he can't control it anymore. It gets out of his control. It's a nuclear power story, if I ever heard one. And he finds a mare, a female horse, and he puts the fire in her mouth, and he sends her down to the bottom of the ocean. And the ocean waters are big enough and powerful enough that they keep the flame in her mouth from getting loose and destroying the world. And at the same time, the flame in her mouth is powerful enough that it keeps causing the ocean, we would say, to evaporate, to keep the ocean waters from rising enough. So there's this tender balance between the fire that would get out and the water that would get out, and they keep themselves just like that. And they keep themselves, and they will be like that until doomsday. And then God will whistle to this mare. It's interesting, she's a female animal, but we can talk about that some other time. And she comes out of the ocean, and her flame will burn the entire universe. And then the ocean waters, freed from the constraints of her fiery mouth, will flood the universe, and everything will be a universal ocean. And in that, God sleeps. Sometimes it's Vishnu, sometimes it's somebody else. And eventually the world will be created again. So that's a very old Indian story about how you can control very dangerous weapons that you create for one reason and then are stuck with them. It is a great myth about nuclear energy, I think. And it's a scary one, because if you don't believe that Vishnu is going to recreate the world after everything becomes water, then we're in real trouble. So that's a story that comes out of that roundhouse, created for, it's an old story. I don't know. It's alluded to in the Mahabharata. It's really told in the Puranas, maybe 6th, 7th century AD. It's an old story. It's long before the creation of nuclear energy, but it is useful, I think. It's the way people were thinking about the problem of nuclear energy after Hiroshima. And it's a good story. It's a sad story. It's a scary story.
Hindu nationalists have become increasingly invested in rewriting Indian history and also mythology to serve a majoritarian political agenda. Since the BJP, whose platform openly embraces Hindutva, came to power in 2014, this ahistorical narrative building has accelerated, moving beyond social media and political rhetoric into academic institutions and textbooks. That same year, just before Modi took office, a retired Hindu school teacher succeeded in pressuring Penguin India to withdraw your book, The Hindus and Alternative History, on the grounds that it offended religious sensibilities under India's blasphemy law. You've spent your career studying and interpreting Hinduism, yet your work has long been a target of vilification by vocal groups of Hindu fundamentalists. Could you talk about that experience and how it revealed the extent to which Hindutva voices now shape political and cultural discourse in India? And why do Hindu nationalists care so deeply about controlling myths? And what do you think are the consequences of their growing influence over these narratives?
So that story about me and Penguin has always been told in different ways, sometimes wrong. What really happened was that Penguin India published the book, and shortly thereafter, Penguin India was bought by an international conglomeration in Germany that took over. And when Mr. Batra, Dinanath Batra, Modi's henchman, brought the case against the book, the people at the top in Germany of Penguin International told the people in India to drop the book. And the man who was in charge of Penguin India at that time was a man named Ravi Singh, who resigned from Penguin India. And the book was dropped. It was never banned in India because the case never came to law. Penguin said, okay, we'll drop it. And nor was the book ever burnt because all the last copies were immediately gobbled up. And Ravi Singh, having left Penguin, started a company of his own called Speaking Tiger and republished the book, which was not banned or in any way threatened. I mean, lots of writers have been threatened in India and some of them have been killed. We're talking about that. Nothing actually happened. No legal case was brought against the book. For a while, it was sold under the counter in back rooms. In the end, it sold over 100,000 copies, much more than any book I have ever written. There's a great American theatrical producer, P.T. Barnum, who was a circus man, who said there's no such thing as bad publicity. He did me a great favor. The book has been absolutely a great success. I still get some hate mail about it by people who don't seem to have read it. And I get fan mail about it all the time from people in India saying how they read it and they really liked it. So the book has been in every way my greatest success. The law, however, under which it was prosecuted is a very bad law. It was a law that the British made in the 1920s to protect Muslims. And it's a really silly law. It says that it is against the law to write anything, publish anything that would offend someone's religious sensibilities. So if you write a book in which you say the moon rises in the east and sets in the west, and I say, I have a religion which says the moon rises in the west and sets in the east, and I got very upset when I read that sentence, the book can be banned on that. It's an insane law. It's an entirely subjective law, and as far as I know, it is still on the books in India. As I said, the British meant it to protect Muslims. So the law itself was crazy. One of the things that I said in the Hindus was that I quoted Swami Vivekananda, who said, I eat meat when it's properly cooked, which is a famous thing that he said. And Mr. Batra didn't say that he didn't say it. He said it made me feel really bad when I read that. And the book was banned. So it's an insane law. It's been used against other people besides me. And in this particular case, it did me nothing but good because of the great bravery and initiative of Ravi Singh, whose company, Speaking Tiger, has gone on to publish many, many wonderful books and to continue to publish my books in India, and indeed has just published other people's myths and has said that he's going to publish my memoir, although I did say, read it first. You don't know what's in it. He said, well, we'll do a little editing perhaps. But he does plan to publish it with a little editing, perhaps. We'll see what it is. So Ravi Singh was the hero of that story. He stood up to them and he won. But that law is still on the books, and many other people have been prosecuted. Many other authors have been killed. Bad things are happening because books are still powerful. And the version of Hinduism that the Hindutva agenda of Modi is propending, there's no resemblance to Hinduism, to what people in India really believe. I mean, there's no such thing as one Hinduism. There are millions of Hinduisms. It's a wonderfully individualistic religion. People do this, they do that. You can't say it's all one thing. You also can't say it's all in Hindi. The diversity of India is what drew me to it in the first place. I thought I can spend my whole life studying this religion and I still won't know a tenth of what it's about. It's just so rich. Every time I read something, I found something entirely new. There's no way of saying the Ramayana is our book. The Bhagavad Gita is a book. Bhagavad Gita wasn't anybody's book. It was never a primary text till the British came to India and said to some Brahmin in Calcutta, where is your Bible? And he said, here, and showed them the Gita. Most Indians don't read the Gita, and when you do read the Gita, what does it tell you? It tells you it's just fine to wage war because the body doesn't count and the soul goes to heaven. Go ahead, kill your brothers, kill your cousins, kill everybody. That's the message of the Gita. So it isn't the Hindu Bible. It shouldn't be the Hindu Bible. There is no Hindu Bible. Lots and lots of Hindus have lots and lots of texts that they love and care about. And that's why it is such a fabulous religion. I don't think that Modi can ruin Hinduism. I don't think anybody can ruin Hinduism. He can certainly ruin the lives of an awful lot of people in India. We have somebody doing that now in our country. So I can hardly point the finger. We're in the same boat, and it's a very leaky boat. But I do think that whatever happens to the people of India, God help them, and of my country, Hindu stories will go on being told in the villages and in the cities, and people will write books, and people will make movies, and the stories will continue to be told. They're too wonderful to fade out, but people may suffer. People may be jailed. People may be killed. That's something that scholars of literature cannot control. But the stories, I think, will survive. They do. They seem to. You just need a couple of people to remember the stories. There are all sorts of Hindu myths about that, where at Kali Yuga comes, the earth is destroyed by flame. The mare with the fire in her mouth comes out, everything's burned. Turns out not everything was burnt. There's these caves where some people have been hiding, and as soon as the flames subside and the water subside, they come out and they remember the stories and they start telling them again. And that's a myth I hold on to. For your country and for mine.
Thank you, Wendy, and I'm glad we got to end our conversation on that hopeful note. And thank you so much for this brilliant conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was truly an honor to have you on the podcast, and I hope we can sit down together again to talk about your memoir soon.
It was a great pleasure. I haven't thought about these questions for a long time. You asked really good questions, and it was fun thinking of answers to them, and I would love to discuss certain parts of my memoir with you when Robbie publishes the book. See you then.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of Southasia podcast, hosted by Associate Editor Nayantara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. Himal is now also bringing you a new podcast series, Partitions of the Heart, by the peace activist Harsh Mandar. So please tune in to Season 1 for his conversations on the crisis facing India's Muslims amid the rule of the Hindu right. We've hit a special milestone this month. The Himal Southasian YouTube channel now has 2,000 subscribers. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and help us spread the word by sharing these episodes widely. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian writing and ideas like no other. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to support our work, please do become a paying Himal patron for just $5 a month. We have a great program with lots of perks, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic Southasia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.